Welcome. This is the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, Forbes contributor, and general explorer of the service and experience space. The thing I'm really interested in is how do we create organizations that produce better outcomes for both their customers and their people. This podcast has been running since January 2011, and so we have a big archive to explore. Check out the archive at adrianswinscoe.com. That's enough from me. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Gareth Higgins, who is an Irish writer and story activist. Now, he'll explain about what that means in due course, but I just want to say, Gareth, nice to see you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Adrian. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Now, Gareth, you'll do a much, much better job of describing kind of who you are and what you kind of do than I would ever do. So for the benefit of our listeners and people that read some of the highlights I put together after these podcasts when they go out, can you give me a bit of a thumbnail sketch about you, your work, and sort of just yourself in general?
Sure. Well, I'm from just outside Belfast in the north of Ireland or Northern Ireland. And there we go. In the first sentence, I'm already telling you something about myself, because where I'm from, we have a disagreement about what the name of the place is and what the meaning of the place is. And if you say Northern Ireland, people would reasonably assume that you're pro-British, probably Protestant. You want that part of the island to remain within the United Kingdom. And if you say the north of Ireland, people would assume that you're Irish, pro-Irish, probably Catholic, and that you want Ireland to be reunited. And if you do what I do, which is to say I'm from the north of Ireland or Northern Ireland, people might assume that you don't want to take a position or you're sitting on the fence. That's not actually what I'm doing. It's in the realm of what you've already referred to as story activism. I think the stories we tell about things shape our reality in a profound way, much more profound than many of us think. There's a tissue paper thin boundary between reality and the story we tell about it. And if we're telling a story that moves us toward more separation and more selfishness and more scapegoating, well, you can guess what kind of life you're going to get, what kind of world you're going to build.
Sure.
And on the other hand, if we're telling a story that's moving us to more union of people with each other and people with the ecosystem of which we're all a part, and more responsibility and more creativity and more community, well, you can guess what kind of life you're more likely to get and what kind of world you'll be building. So for me, to say that I'm from this place with two names, and there's other names for it as well. I was going
to ask about that. I was going to say, so where does Ulster fit into that?
Ulster is a really interesting word as well, because Ulster has two meanings as well. Ulster is one of the four provinces of Ireland. The other three are Munster, Leinster, and Connaught. And in terms of the geography and the map of the island, Ulster is the 9 northern counties of Ireland, but when people say Ulster, what they usually mean is the state called Northern Ireland, which is the 6 northeastern counties. So there's 2 Ulsters, and because some people refer to the rest of Ireland as the Republic of Ireland, and some people refer to it as the South.
Right.
There's a lovely piece of humor here in that Donegal, which has the northernmost point of the island of Ireland, is in the province of Ulster. And that means that the most northern point of Ireland is in the south. So I don't like the kind of humor that makes Irishness the butt of a joke, unless Irish people ourselves are telling those jokes in a self-deprecating way. But I like the humor of not taking ourselves too seriously in areas where it's a good idea to not take yourself too seriously. And having grown up there, I was 19 when the ceasefires were called in 1994. So I came of age during the what some people call the Northern Ireland Troubles. And I became, into my late teens, early 20s at the time when the peace process was really getting underway. And I was recruited into the peace movement by older mentors. And so my kind of university days and so on, I was involved on the fringes of peace activism, bridge building, and so on. And what emerged from that was this idea that if the story you're telling is not true, then it's worth questioning it. And the only way you're going to find out if it's not true is if you ask, is it true? And the only way you're going to be able to ask that if you ask yourself, first of all, what is the story I'm telling? And, I hope I'm not laboring it too much, but that example of the very name of the place that you're from, I mean, there's like 5 or 6 things we've already talked about in a couple of minutes. Northern Ireland, north of Ireland, Protestant, Catholic, Irish, British, Donegal, the South, the Republic, Unionist, Nationalist. That's 11 things, right? And like, I'm actually all of those things in some respects. And then you could ask yourself questions like, what does my name mean? Like, why are you called Adrian? What have you been? What's the story you've been told about that name? Why your parents gave it to you, so on and so forth. And what are the associations you have with that name? And then we get into questions like, what have I been told about who my tribe is?
Sure.
And who are the good guys and who are the bad guys and why? And to start questioning, how true are these stories? And if they're not the most true version that we could find, which they won't be the most true version that we can find.
No, they'll be partial.
So at best they'll be partial. At worst they'll be completely false.
Yes.
And so I think there's somewhere between completely false and partial. Then wouldn't it be great to explore what is a more true version, a less partial version? And then the second question I always ask is the story I'm telling the most helpful version of that story? And can we move toward a more helpful version? Not just so that we can live happier lives, because frankly, sometimes the truth is less happy in the short term. You might have to confront things about yourself. You really might have to face that your guys aren't the good guys, or that it's not as black and white, and you may have some responsibilities, but like, there is a liberation in the truth. There is a liberation in reimagining your story and the place you are in relation to the story. So I consider myself, I'm very grateful to have grown up in an environment where I was being invited to think about these things. I'm very sad and I have deep grief for the suffering in my society and for the suffering my own family experienced. And it became an environment in which I started to see that active involvement in reducing violence and in reducing hostility is one of the most important things any of us can do with our lives. And the story I'm telling is deciding for me pretty much everything about me, almost everything about me.
Sure. I mean, I think so first of all, I should say that we were introduced to each other via Ari Weinsvik. And so big shout out to Ari and everybody at Zingerman's that we both know Ari, and we've both visited Zingerman's, and we were talking about it before we actually pressed record and about what they can do. And so yeah, big wave and big shout out to them. But as you were saying, a large part of your work is focused on storytelling, and the reason why I wanted to have you on the podcast was to talk about storytelling, because it's often talked about when people talk about leadership. They talk about setting and agreeing a vision, engaging people, motivating them with respect to a change, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But like also how you described is like, despite all the talk, I don't think many people are necessarily good at telling stories, or they only tell partial stories or false stories or whatever. I mean, to the nub of it, why are people, do you think, not very good at telling those good stories, even despite the fact that we naturally tell stories as people? Why are people kind of like better at it than other people do you think?
Well, I'm not very good at playing the saxophone.
Right.
Despite having taken a year of lessons when I was 13.
Okay.
and then I gave up. But maybe a better instrument, one that maybe most people, certainly at least most people in the UK and Ireland who are listening to this, I don't know about other cultures. Most of us had a recorder in our hand at some point when we were a child.
Mm-hmm.
And if you pick up the recorder, and if you don't know what a recorder is, it's like a very basic thing that looks like a clarinet.
It's like a penny whistle.
Like a penny. Yeah, like a penny whistle. Yeah.
There you go.
And you pick it up, you could put it to your lips, and you could just breathe through it, and you'd be if a nice tune came out, that would be an accident.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the sounds you'd make wouldn't be strung together particularly well. You have to learn how to do it, and so most of us haven't been initiated into the art of storytelling, to the craft of storytelling. We've all been, and I've been this person, but I still am this person where I my stories may not be sometimes they could be more concise than they are. I've been told that by some people, and some stories need to be epics. But we've all been in environments that are quite funny, where somebody's trying to tell a story and they are going on every tributary possible. And there's a whole lot of, and then she said to me, and then I said to her, and then he said to me, and then we did this, and then we did that, and people get lost in the story, and you sort of feel sorry for them. You need to give it a soft landing. We're not all Billy Connolly Billy Connolly's way of storytelling is to start in point A, and then he goes all over the world, and like you're halfway through, you go, what's this got to do with where he started? And then he has this genius of bringing it back to point A, or some resonance with that. That's an art, and it needs to be taught. That's one piece about why many of us aren't that good at it. I think a second one is most of us haven't had the experience of being truly listened to.
Right. Okay.
We get rushed by the person who, get to the point.
I feel like, I tell you what, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's a bit like that, kind of having that conversation sort of thing. And I always say to people, have you ever asked them that, like, have you ever been in a conversation where you're listening to the other person sort of speak, but you're listening with this idea that I'm just waiting for you to finish before I tell you what I think.
Uh-huh.
And then they go, oh yeah. I said, then you weren't listening.
Yeah.
And then they go, oh. But it's that ping pong, right? It's been a conversation, not necessarily as a listening and exchanging exercise, but it's a listening of like, it's almost it's like a competition.
I'm really trying to listen to you while you speak so that I don't fall into the same trap. And yes, the culture you and I come from, shared overlapping cultures, very much conversation is about ping pong, or it's about trying to ensure that the other person agrees with you, or persuade them to agree with you, rather than listening for the purpose of understanding. And that's a much better way. If you and I have a conversation and all that happens is that I understand you better by the end of the conversation, it was worth it. And hopefully the next time we talk, you would understand me better, maybe even better. We can both understand each other more in the context of a conversation. I think most people have never been truly listened to, and they certainly don't listen. They don't live in cultures where that's like an everyday experience or characteristic, being truly heard. And then I think the third thing is the foundational parameters of storytelling include some things that I believe we need to evolve beyond. And we can reduce that down to them versus us.
Right.
That if you look at the history of storytelling, the earliest written down manuscript, or it may even be on tablets of stone, that we are aware of, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Babylonian creation myth. And there are some cave paintings that have been discovered that are older than that. But in terms of like a story, narrative story, and that story suggests that the world was created through a horrendous act of violence. And, we could talk for weeks about this, but long story short, and it really is the longest story because it's been one that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. I think that idea that what some people call the myth of redemptive violence is foundational to the way we think about story, which is basically, I have to win, or my people have to win. And that is so deeply embedded in the DNA of our culture that to question it gets written off, ignored, downplayed, mocked, or even attacked. You know, when some people try to offer a non-violent alternative to violence, it triggers a response from people saying, "Well, are you saying that these people should just roll over and be oppressed?" Or and like you can get it's interesting. You get a violent response when you advocate non-violence.
Yeah,
and yeah, we have evolved. Now we don't just raid each other's villages once every 2 years and kill everybody in the village and steal their houses. What we do is we try to compete with each other to take as much as we can from other people.
Yeah.
Now, not all of us do that, and we don't do it all the time, but that's still kind of embedded in our culture. And that, I think, is that of those three things that I've named, people haven't been taught the craft, people haven't been listened to. It may be most important of all, the very structure of storytelling, which says there's an us and there's a them, or there's a you and there's a me. And our relationship to each other should mostly be about defending ourselves from each other and making sure that they don't get one over on us before we get one over on them. That there's a line past which all of us have enemies. That has to be seriously questioned and evolved beyond into an imagining of stories that promote the curiosity that maybe my neighbor isn't my enemy, even if they think they are.
Yeah.
Even if they think they are, and that maybe collaboration, cooperation can actually go hand in hand with holding boundaries where safety and protection is necessary and where amends and accountability is necessary, rather than putting the cart before the horse, which is to say, like I've already said, get one over on them before they get one over on you.
So if I think about that particularly in a organizational context, when people start telling a story about setting a vision and all these different things, for me, it occurs to me there's a part of that is all about, and this is how we win. And a lot of it's about competing and kind of like overcoming competition and all these different things, which is a bit like a them and us type of thing. But I think what you're doing is you're suggesting actually it needs to be more sophisticated than that, a bit more sort of nuanced than that. If you want to kind of like reframe it to be inclusive and progressive and more collaborative and cooperative, all these different sort of things. I mean, and I guess it then changes the definition of what a good story is, and if a good story requires a hero or heroine to prevail, as it were.
Yeah. And what does prevail actually mean? And I would say, with respect, it's more than just more sophisticated. I think it's a radical overhaul. And
right.
Like at the risk of advocating a form of violence, it's like we have to detonate the old version of storytelling. But what would be better would be to just rebuild something new in its place, and to start from the premise that there is no them. There is only us. That as human beings, we have more in common with any other human being simply by being human. And again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have boundaries. The metaphor I use is it's like we're all being invited into a room where there's a great meal being served, and the table keeps expanding and expanding, and at the moment there's room for 8 billion people at that table, because that's about the number. It's about 8 billion people who live on the planet at the moment, and everybody's invited. There's only one rule, and the rule is you have to commit to not harming anybody else. And if you can't commit to that rule, then you can't come into the room and you can't sit at the table. You have to stay outside, because it's the only way we can guarantee safety. Well, you can't fully guarantee it, but it's the only responsible thing to do. But that doesn't mean we're going to leave you there alone. Every now and again, some of us will go out and check on you and say, hey, Adrian, are you willing to commit to this rule yet? Is there anything you legitimately need that you don't have? And again, this comes from my experience of witnessing the peace process in Northern Ireland, that the actual formal dialogues couldn't begin until all the parties committed to exclusively nonviolent and peaceful means to achieve political ends. I don't know why we shouldn't have the same rule for any interaction. And we do. I mean, for most of our interactions in the world, we don't have to have an explicitly stated, I'm not going to harm the person that I meet in the supermarket, or I'm not going to be violent to the train conductor. But it would be good if we did become more conscious about what does harm mean. And I want to walk something back there, because when I say you need to commit to not harming anybody, it'd probably be better to say, I'm going to commit to not consciously harm anybody. And because I probably will make mistakes and step on your toes or hurt your feelings at some point. But I want to be on a conscious journey toward learning more and more and more about what it means, not only to do less harm and eventually no harm, but to do good and to amplify love and light in the lives of the people around me, and to invite that from other people as well, which points toward, I mean, another dimension of storytelling that we really need to kind of inflate, like a saggy balloon that needs to be inflated, is the whole definition of the word love. You know, love is a greeting card slogan, and love gets kind of considered as a weak thing often, or as a sentimental thing. Although I do think there's an evolution happening. It's interesting to me how many cisgender men now feel comfortable telling their cisgender male friends, I love you. That's something that is really only the last 20 years has become much more available. But I'd want to go further than that and redefine love as, yes, it involves the sentiment. Yes, it involves the kindness and the warmth and the care. But it's also something that involves risk. When you open yourself to say I love you to somebody, they may not reciprocate, and you will lose that person at some point. Even if you stay together for 70 years, one of you is going to die. Deeper than that, there's a definition of love that comes from psychology that says love is extending yourself for the benefit of others. So love is not just about what do I get. I remember a guy I heard giving a talk about 30 years ago he and his spouse would do premarital counseling for couples who were going to get married. Okay. And he said that when the couples would come, and if one of them would say, I really love him, or I really love her, or I really love them, and then they would ask, well, what do you mean by that? If the person said, oh, she just makes me feel so good, or variations on that, if that was all they said, this guy Jim was his name, he would sort of challenge them and say, there's a red flag going up for me there, because love is not just about what the other person makes you feel. Love is about your commitment and service to them. And this is not exclusive to marital or partnered or triad relationships. This is about how humans are invited to relate to every other human. I can't be in an intimate relationship with everybody I meet, of course, but I can waken up to the possibility that every encounter I have with another person is an opportunity for me to love them and for them to love me. Like we're talking right now. We've had one conversation before on a personal basis. We're having this conversation now. We may or may not ever talk again, but why wouldn't we want to use this time to amplify the possibility of affirmation, kindness, creativity, learning, listening, all these things within the definition of love that include how I feel around you, which is I feel nice and affirmed and warm, and I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you very much. Very nice.
But I want you to be affirmed in your work, and then the two of us become more than the sum of our parts if we both bring that consciousness.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you what, you said something there, which you said that how love is defined, and it was like love is defined as an extension of yourself in almost in service of others. I think there was
for the benefit of others, or for the benefit. Let's even it could just be for the benefit of the good,
right? But if you just take that, it's like the extension of yourself for the benefit of others. And I think about that, and I think about, well, there's, and particularly the domain that I'm in, and I think that's a really useful way of framing it. When people talk about, oh, we love our customers, I'm like, okay, here's the definition: extension of yourself for the benefit of others. Now ask yourself, like, going, so are you really loving your customers within that sort of frame?
Yeah.
And I go, that's a really, it's a fascinating thing, because again, it's a story then that they tell themselves about kind of what they're doing and how they're doing, and whether that really fits with the whole love idea.
And like, there's also, when it comes to business, there's three, I suppose you could call it, objects of love. There's the loving of the loving customers. There's the business leaders loving their employees
as well. Yeah, sure.
And there's the business leaders or business owners loving themselves. It's not healthy if the love is only going one way. That's martyrdom, and some people are called to martyrdom, but most of us aren't. We're all called to service. And so, the person who brought us together, Ari, what I've observed at Zingerman's, which I'm sure is not a perfect place, like nowhere is a perfect place, but what I've felt at Zingerman's is the customers are loved, the employees are loved, and the leaders are loved. That everybody's experiencing something of their needs being met and of mutual respect being in place. There are some businesses that if at some jobs where if you were to really think about this question of love, you might shut down the business. Actually, you might decide my business can't love by the nature of what it sells. If it's absolutely degrading the earth, or if it's hurting people. And there have been lovely examples in history of where people have transitioned their businesses to be a more common good-oriented version of the same thing. There's a lovely fellow called Mark Silver who runs a company called Heart of Business in the US, and he mentors small business owners in what he calls every act of business can be an act of love. And he's taught me a whole lot. I think it's the same for every act of politics can be an act of love. Every act of culture can be an act of love. And there's no reason that we shouldn't be deciding that's our first principle here. Is this loving? And again, it doesn't mean you don't have boundaries. You can, I hate to even say that, you can fire somebody in a loving way.
I tell you what, you just kind of made me think about the best story that I was ever told about a company. Like, I feel like exhibiting love for somebody when they had to fire them. And it came from a guy called Henry Stewart, who runs a company called Happy. And they used to do just computer training, but now they do all sorts of different sort of things, particularly around training, leadership development, all these different things. And they have this philosophy where they had told me this story that he said, when they fire somebody, and it could be for whatever, even for gross negligence or misconduct or whatever, they don't just kind of fire them and banish them and say, be gone. They have this idea where they kind of like, through the care and love they have for the person, is they will work hard to have them placed in a new position somewhere else. Because they realize that actually how you part is almost just as important about how you meet.
Sure.
And it's just that, he said that just because we might not have been able to make it work doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't kind of help somebody.
And of course, that would come at the end of a process where attempts had been made to make it work. Like, you don't just snap your fingers and they're gone. But you think about, like, at the end of the day, the what some people call the golden rule, which is to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, or don't treat other people the way you wouldn't want to be treated. This shows up in all spiritual wisdom traditions that humanity has ever evolved.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also in what you might call secular philosophical traditions. And it aligns with contemporary neuroscience and psychology.
Right.
There is every reason to imagine that if we experimented with it, it might work.
Funny that.
You never know. And you might not see results on the first day.
Sure.
But to be results oriented is even that, and that's a tricky thing when we're talking about business. But to be results obsessed isn't the point.
No.
It's to experience what we're in right now. And I often fear, the fears that come up for me are, oh my god, what if such and such happens? What if something such goes wrong? And as I sit with it and reflect a bit and kind of pay attention to the kinds of things I try to teach other people, which are just as hard for me to embody, I often come to this place of, it's not the thing happening to me that's the most frightening. The thing that I should fear the most is not living, because anything can happen today or tomorrow. There may be no tomorrow. And all spiritual wisdom traditions, all the credible philosophical traditions and contemporary neuroscience and psychology agrees with me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, live today. There can be there's just sort of be a strategic discernment in imagining, what would I do if I knew I had 6 months? We've often heard, what would you do if you knew today was going to be your last day? I get the question, and there's a certain poetry to it. It's not a particularly helpful question, because if I woke up this morning and you told me I'm going to be dead by the end of today, I would be panicking and scrambling and running around wondering, who am I going to spend time with, and who do I need to give my PIN number to, and like, did I leave the gas on? Much more helpful to think in terms of, if I knew I had 6 months, how would I live? What would I prioritize in that time? How could I shift the energy inside me, the fear energy, the distress energy, and find people who I can ask, hey, listen, could you love me through this? It's not rocket science. It's just countercultural to the dominant ways that many of us have been raised. And I'm optimistic, actually, about some of the things I see being completely normative among younger people. Mm-hmm. Vulnerability, openness, love, catch yourself on, don't be homophobic, don't be transphobic, don't be racist, don't be misogynistic, don't be obsessed with money. Mm-hmm. If we have to all live together in variations on student housing until we're 45 years old because we can't afford to get on the property market, yeah, there's a serious problem with the economics of the society. But actually, it's not a bad idea if people live together in groups, because it's more likely that their mental health will be better and that they'll look after each other's needs, and that we will, once we, if we ever do move into, I don't know what you call them, nuclear family units, that we will have meaningful bonds of connection that will sustain us. Because
we will have actually learned those bonds, right, through other kind of means. And I think, but it feels to me that it's actually, again, it's this new kind of emergent sort of like story of how things kind of evolve.
Oh yeah.
Stuff. But I think what I wanted to circle back to the story kind of thing, because this is like that you can talk about kind of like storytelling as a skill, right? And it's to be kind of learned, which sort of implies that you might be rubbish at it to start with, and you will fail. And you've got to get over that sort of thing. But like, how should people, I mean, particularly if they're leaders, because I think this is the thing that's fraught with kind of people that are in leadership positions, is they kind of worry about being wrong in front of their kind of people. Mm-hmm. So if people want to kind of become a better storyteller or start a journey towards becoming a better storyteller, I mean, well, what should they do? And so what sort of things should they be practicing or adopting to actually get better at it?
Yeah. Lovely question. And certainly, the idea that people might fear getting it wrong, that is a very reasonable fear, because, people have had experiences of being judged or reacted against and, shamed I've had that happen to me, and I've done it to other people unconsciously and maybe consciously too. And so, like, we need to create environments in which people can feel safe to make mistakes. And there are storytelling communities that allow for that. You know, in my work in life, we do some stuff like that where we give people an opportunity to fail. You know, and to craft a story. So, like, if someone's actually standing up and doing oral storytelling, we would suggest to them 10 minutes, which is 1,400 words or less. And anybody who tells us, "Oh, I can do 1,600 in 10 minutes," our answer is no, you can't. Nobody can. And write it out, write the story out, and share it with someone who you think is a better storyteller than you are. It's the same thing as with learning anything. Find someone who knows. Like, when you're learning how to fix a car, you ask someone who knows how to fix the car, or you look at a YouTube video. So that's one piece. There's a wonderful book about this by Mark Iaconelli, who does storytelling events in the Pacific Northwest in the US. And I am looking up the title of the book as we speak. It is called Between the Listening and the Telling.
Okay.
And it's the best book I've read on storytelling. I would encourage anybody who is doing that kind of storytelling in a leadership role, particularly, or just wants to get better at telling stories, to look at that book, Between the Listening and the Telling. And then the last thing I'd say is we have to evolve models and examples in public life of where people can say, "I made a mistake. I'm acknowledging that mistake. I'm apologizing for that mistake. These are the amends that I am going to offer for that mistake." And I recognize the people most affected by that mistake are the ones who have priority access to evaluating whether or not those amends are adequate. We don't have hardly any examples in public life of someone who made a mistake and acknowledged, apologized, and made amends. What we have, for the most part, is two different things. It's often politicians. There's immediate resignation and no mercy.
Yeah.
That's one. And the other is brush it under the rug and pretend it doesn't matter. There's a third way. Some people do need to resign. Some people shouldn't be in leadership roles once they've done certain things, for sure. But there's a third option, which is what I've just laid out, which is to acknowledge the error, acknowledge the impact, offer amends, and have the people who were most impacted have priority access to evaluating the amends. And it may be that you need to step away from public, and maybe you never get to do those kind of public roles again, but you still have a meaningful life using the gifts and skills that you have. I think about, I mean, there's some examples emerging around that, but still very, very few. And you and I, as members of the public, have a role in how we respond the next time a public figure makes a genuine apology. Because if we just write them off or condemn them, we are playing a role in continuing to build a merciless society, and a society which wants retribution rather than restoration, and can't tell the difference between accountability and amends and the crucifixion of somebody. And nobody deserves to be crucified.
But also in this kind of like the idea about kind of like people think about leadership and storytelling, and there's also kind of like, probably need to bust the myth that it needs to be the leader's responsibility to tell the story.
Oh yeah.
And to be the story originator. And actually talked about that idea of actually listening to understand, and almost doing that I'm going to listen to understand, and that could become a storytelling exercise in of itself by getting other people to tell their stories. And as you gather and give air to other people's stories, excuse me, that can be almost create its own meta story by giving people voice.
Yeah. There can be a storytelling method that dominates the room and silences everybody else. And, like when I go to a Bruce Springsteen concert, I want Bruce and the E Street Band to dominate the room.
Yeah,
but
sure.
That's performance. If I go to see Ian McKellen on stage, that's the point. But there's a difference between performance and story sharing. And the idea of sitting around a fire with a talking stick where everybody gets to speak. Yes, there are tribal chiefs and there are medicine people and there are shamans who have a particular purchase on the story, and somebody always needs to go first. But part of the task of leadership is to know when to move in and when to move out, and when to say, what do you think? Or something I've seen Ari do several times is, when an employee at Zingerman's comes up to the table when we're having a meal, he'll say, "This is so and so," and they'll say, "Hey, tell Gareth about your, such and such," and they'll and so he doesn't hog the floor. So
Sure.
it's a discernment balance around what part the person in leadership has to do in kind of pushing the sled down the hill, and what part is to be shared. And that's something that can only really be learned as you do it.
Yeah. And because I think this is just an important sort of distinction. So not to let people kind of think, oh my God, that's me. And it's like going, all of a sudden you're up on stage, stood there, and then the spotlight goes on and you're like, oh, and I'm going to tell a story. You're like, and be a performer. Sometimes that's just anathema to people. And they're like going, I don't know where to start. But actually, you don't necessarily have to own the story. You sometimes just need to discover the story.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes that can be about kind of just talking to other people and maybe giving kind of voice to other people's perspectives.
And people, if we're talking about organizations, people at every level of the organization, if it's trying to be an enlightened, open-minded organization that promotes the common good, everybody should feel like they do own part of the story. And they have to be invited into that and maybe initiated into that. I've definitely dealt with or been interacting with people in a kind of a customer service world where I'm engaging with someone who has not been empowered at all.
Sure.
And who is probably underpaid, and they just haven't been given any sense of ownership over the thing. And I've sometimes interacted with people who you can just feel it. And even if they have to say, hey, I don't know the answer to that, but I know the person who does know the answer. But I'm going to reassure you that I'm going to find that out for you. Like the act of reassurance, part of the story of that organization is we are an organization that prioritizes reassuring our clients.
Yeah.
Putting their minds at ease. That's way more than, I don't actually need you to know the answer, but if you just tell me that you can help me find the answer, that's 90%. That's nearly all the work.
Well, it's like psychologically, you're going like, somebody just told me, I got you, and you believe them. And you're like going, I now feel comfortable.
Yep. Or, and frankly, it doesn't even have to go that far. It can, I had a personal situation a long time ago where something very painful happened in my life. And a friend of mine texted me and he said, I don't know the answers, but I will come and sit in the ashes with you. Right. And they weren't literal ashes. And that's what he did. He came and sat with me, and his presence was enough. And so I think just being, the way even bots have been programmed to do this now, where they say, I can, you write to your customer service bot and say, this is my problem. And they write back and say, I see that your problem is such and such. I am certainly going to do what I can to make sure that everything is made right. Right. I take that with a pinch of salt. But when somebody says to me, wow, I can imagine how that feels. I don't have any knowledge or information about that, but I imagine how that feels.
Yeah.
Or, that must be tough. Or, it's completely it's completely understandable that you ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you why the question is irrelevant. Like, as long if someone were to say, you're not stupid for asking it,
Mm-hmm.
So.
But I think, but I think that what I wanted to say is that, because I think the thing is that we've got to almost like not dispel, but tell a different story, if you like, about what we expect of leaderships and what storytelling in that leadership, and particularly whether it's an organization or organizational or kind of community or societal kind of context. And that sometimes it's not just about this sort of idea of the hero kind of like story, but actually there's different ways of doing it. And it can feel sometimes slower to do it like that, but sometimes it can be more resilient and more more resilient and more evolving and more robust in many ways, because you're engaging kind of more people. And so I think I just wanted to do, and that's why I love to listen to you about the kind of telling a story about storytelling, and how to kind of do it better, because I think it is a skill. It can be learned. It can be done in different ways, and it's important because that's, as human beings, we engage with stories. We remember things that are more story based than we do kind of facts and figures.
And even the most mundane facts of our lives can be monumentally important. There's a story I always tell. I read it when I was a child. I've never been able to find the reference. I believe this story is true.
Okay.
I believe the story is factual. Even if it's not factual, I believe it's true.
Yeah, there you go.
There was a guy, I believe in England. I read this in one of those kind of, strange facts of the world books that you read when you're a kid. And he had an uncontrollable sneezing disorder, which is actually really distressing. Like, he sneezed basically all day long. And, it's like when you have a really dramatic sneeze, it can shake your whole body.
Mm-hmm.
This guy was doing this. I'm sensing dozens, if not hundreds of times a day. And this went on for years. And then one day he went to pour the muesli that he had for breakfast every day out of the muesli box, and there wasn't enough in the box, so he didn't have his muesli for breakfast that day, and he didn't sneeze. And it turned out he was allergic to an ingredient in the muesli.
Wow.
And here's the thing. The universally held story about muesli is that it's good for you.
Yeah.
You would think there's no real reason to question that story. In his case, muesli was nothing less than poison.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a story, unconscious, but a story nonetheless. Muesli is good for me. And so it never occurred to him to question this. And he lived with years of life-altering distress because he never learned to question the story. And then by chance, one day, the story got questioned for him and his life turned around instantly. I'm not saying that that's possible or likely for everything in our lives. Of course it's not. But if it was true for even one or two meaningful things in your life, that you're believing a story unconsciously, that something is good for you, but actually it's poison, or that something can't be changed when actually it really would just take a slight adjustment to change it, wouldn't it be worth trying?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that for me, that kind of like, it makes me think about, and it's like a reference to a punk thing. And Henry Rollins, who was one of the most famous kind of like, was the lead singer of Black Flag, the second one, then they kind of like replaced the first one. And then went on to be kind of a solo career. And when asked what punk was, he said, question everything. And that's the story that you tell yourself, is like, question everything. It's like, it can be done differently. Does it have to be done? What are we telling ourselves about this? Is this right? If it's not right, does it not feel right? If it's not working kind of well, then kind of let's question it. And I think that's what it applied. What's what your story about the muesli implied to me is like, yes, we tell ourselves these things, but sometimes they're not good for us.
Sure.
We don't know that they're not good for us in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But then sometimes an opportunity presents itself where we go, okay.
And the lovely thing about, question part of the problem with the way question everything has kind of, I don't know, permeated the culture is it feels like rebellion, or it feels like we'll never come to any answers. That's not actually, I don't think that's what Henry Rollins.
No.
And I don't think it's what other people who've said, because the thing is, question everything, there are actually some answers.
Yeah.
When that guy questioned his muesli, he found the answer and he never needed to question it again.
Exactly.
Like question everything. If I punch somebody in the face, I shouldn't have to punch someone in the face in order to find out that it's usually not good to do that.
Yeah.
But if I have done that and I question it, and the answer is, wow, that hurt that person and it was unnecessary, I don't need to question it again.
No.
You can get some answers. You won't get they'll always be partial, but have a lens through which you want to ask the question. And the lens that I choose based on my experience of life, and also, as I've said, spiritual wisdom traditions, secular wisdom traditions, neuroscience and psychology, the lens is, does this move us more toward love?
Mm-hmm. Nice. That seems a really nice kind of moment to kind of move on from storytelling. And because I wanted to ask you about something in your book, the How Not to Be Afraid, which I thought, when I read about it, I thought that might be very useful for like the service and community experience that I'm particularly in. And so in your book, you sort of describe a simple but profound model to anyone who wants to build communities that promise mutual support, challenge, inspiration, protection, and service to the common good, right?
Yeah.
And so there you go. There's the intro. Set you up.
Oh, thank you.
Describe it for me. Kind of how does it work?
Thank you, and I love talking about this, and I'll do it really concisely because it deserves to be concise, and it's the kind of thing you could put on a little credit card size thing and put it in your wallet. It's 4 questions, and there. So you need one other person to ask these questions,
right?
With often it's better if you have 2 other people, so there's at least 3 of you, and it's a good idea to keep it at sort of 8 or fewer. I'm in 3 groups that ask questions like this. 2 of them for almost a decade in each case, and they meet every other week. And I'm in a group that's just started a couple of months ago because I need this a lot and I love it. The 4 questions are really simple. What's life-giving to you? Or what's something that's bringing you a spark of hope or joy or goodness? Or you could just say, what's up for you?
Yeah.
And the second question is, what's not life-giving for you? Or what's sparking heaviness or dread, or what's challenging you, or what's down for you? And you limit yourself to one thing when you're having these groups, because it's just about getting a little kind of glimpse into each other's lives. Then the third question is, what's the better story that you want to join? And for me, it's always, I want to join the story of the evolution of love, but then, break that down into specifically in my life, in the mundane practicality of my life, knowing what I will be, or knowing to some degree what I'm going to be doing for the next week or 2 weeks until we meet again. I want to be kind to the person at the checkout in the supermarket, or I want to face this thing that I'm finding it difficult to face because I've got all this negative judgment in me about the other person, but I want to face it with love. Or I want to stop leading conversations with all the complaints that I have.
Right.
Or I really, those would be examples of like, what's the story you want to join? What do you feel called to promote the common good? And then the 4th question is, how can we help each other? And that's where it can get really radical, because sometimes in these groups, you'll have someone who'll say, I really need a babysitter and I can't afford it this Thursday night. And maybe someone in the group can offer that. Or other practical needs. I was in a group, or I'm in a group where someone in the group had a a very sudden bereavement. And what they said for about 18 months in the group was, I just miss Dawn, Don.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just saying it out loud so that it can be heard in my grief. And where the rubber can really hit the road, and where you start to kind of challenge some of the oppressive and selfish norms in our society, is when somebody says, I can't afford my rent.
Mm-hmm.
And can this group help sustain me for a period of time until I get back on my feet?
Mm-hmm.
And for the group to respond with, yes, we will help you sustain, or we'll help you find the help that you need. And we're not going to allow an inequitable power dynamic to creep into this. So you're totally welcome here, even though you're the one that's in financial difficulty at the moment. And you start to kind of transcend class lines there sometimes, and say that, like, you may not have something financial to give to help, but you can also help us in other ways. Sit in the ashes with us when there are ashes,
Sure.
and sit and look at the fireworks and celebrate when something good is happening. So those are just 4 questions. What's life-giving? What's not life-giving? What's the new story or the better story you want to join? And how can we help each other? And they're easily available on our website at theporchcommunity.net. And there's a bit more elaboration on them in my book, How Not to Be Afraid. But I've learned from a lot of teachers that the best things and the best tools should always be free.
Yeah.
The detail, if you want, you could charge for the detail, but the substance of it isn't something that should be held back from anybody on the grounds of the resources that they have.
Mm-hmm. I just thought it's useful because it's like if it promotes, I feel like, better conversations and kind of better outcomes.
Yeah.
And deeper conversations and richer conversations between kind of people and teams and communities and all these different things. And the reality that kind of like, actually sometimes getting stuff done is difficult.
Yeah.
I've just been honest about it and going like, can we help each other? And if it becomes a mechanism for kind of like unlocking some of that sort of stuff, I think it's that's why I thought this is really interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I think that in the kind of, again, in organizations, this is the kind of thing that could be experimented with. And, I'm aware of, somebody told me about a company in the US where there's a weekly all staff meeting. As I recall the story, is something like 60 or 70 staff in a circle. And they're all in a circle together. So the CEO and owner of the business is at the same level as everybody else for this particular meeting, and not for every meeting. And they do what they call, or what I would call restorative accountability. And that is, it's an invitation for people to ask for support with anything they're struggling with, and give reports on here's what's been working and so on. And also to call themselves out for where they know they didn't do what they said they were going to do, or they slacked or something, in an unhealthy way. And that the CEO is expected to do the same. That the CEO will say, I slept in on Tuesday and came in at 10 o'clock. And I know that my agreement with all of you is that I'll be here at the same time as the rest of you. And somebody told me about being in this meeting once where one of the kind of junior staff stood up, and it's not like a Stalinist struggle session. People aren't getting beaten up. It's a beautifully curated and facilitated environment. But one of the junior staff stood up and said to the CEO, "You promised us that you were going to do this thing as a reward, some kind of bonus thing. I think it was like an in-kind thing, like he was going to take them all out to a sports game or something like that. And you haven't done that, and you haven't managed expectations about it, and trust is diminished as a result. And the environment that's been facilitated in this company is such that that person's not going to be penalized for saying so." And apparently the CEO stood up and owned it, and then made a new agreement about how they were going to make amends. And like, why not? Why not? Families should do this.
What?
Schools should do this. Children should be taught. I mean, in fact, thankfully, kids sometimes do get taught things like this in schools these days. Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah. So thank you for sharing that. I mean, I just thought it was like if it helps promote understanding, sharing, collaboration, community, teamwork, all of these different sort of things, then I just thought actually it's very different. To something that some of the standard stuff that you might see in kind of like management books, but I thought it'd be very kind of useful, particularly for, I think, like interesting to me, and I believe that hopefully some of my audience are as kind of their interests are somewhat as esoteric as mine, and so hopefully they'll get some interest out of it. But
yeah,
I know we're marching on. Time is marching on. Wanted to ask: is there anything else that that you want to add or highlight that we've kind of like that we've not touched on that you wanted to mention before I ask you some quick fire kind of like questions at the end?
If people want to connect with the kind of stuff I'm doing, just go to theporchcommunity.net or garethhiggins.net. And if you'd like to take a deep dive on any of this stuff in person, the two best opportunities to do that, one is come with us to Ireland on what we call a retreat, but it's really an immersion experience. It lasts about a week. There's several of them in the summer, and you can find out more about those at irelandretreats.net. They're a place where you learn more about transformative storytelling and also how this society that I'm from is changing. That's irelandretreats.net. And Ari is going to be our guest on one of those in early June this year. Okay. And there are still spaces on that. And I think I've been on probably, we've done 40 or so of these in the last decade. We've had about 400 people. Actually, we've probably done 25 of them. We've had about 400 people come on them. And I love being on them. And people often tell us that they're genuinely life-changing experiences. So I just enjoy getting to be part of that. So lovely if you've been sparked by anything we've talked here and you want to hang out with us and hang out with Ari. That's in early June, and we've another one in October as well. And the last thing is we do an annual event in the US. Just happened a couple of weeks ago, so it'll be next March or so before it happens again. But it's called the Porch Gathering. And that's at theporchgathering.com. All our websites are very intuitive. So we don't have complicated website names.
No, that's fine. I will make sure I kind of like get all that linked up in the highlights and the notes that I kind of I put together. But so a few quick fire questions before we wrap up.
Yeah.
So first one is, we talked about lots of different kind of things, but I always usually ask people to boil things down and give me their sort of their best advice to someone listening in that wants to improve their customer and or employee experience. And what I've been doing recently, experimenting with, is this idea of complete the sentence. So the sentence is, if you want to improve your customer employee experience, Gareth Higgins says, do this. Complete that sentence.
Make work an extension of home rather than home an extension of work. And what I mean by that is people often struggle with work-life balance. And I want wherever you live should be able to be a sanctuary that you choose your boundaries on it. But having seen at Zingerman's how people who work there feel at home there when they go into the building, do what you can to make the physical space and the, emotional, psychological environment of work an extension of home. And ruthlessly, if you're the leader of the business, ruthlessly push yourself to be sure that you're doing everything you can to not ask your employees to make home an extension of work. Let people have their homes, but make work feel like a home.
Great advice. Thank you for that. Now, second question.
Yeah.
Punk one. Obviously, it has to be a punk one because it's a Punk CX podcast.
Yeah.
So here goes. What company or brand do you think takes a punk approach to customer experience, or is, you think, an experienced leader, and why? I mean, I kind of like, who's got it all stitched together, do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think it's the Zingerman's community of businesses in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And it's not just because I'm friends with Ari or because he introduced us, because I've spent time there and I've had this sense of, in the DNA of Zingerman's is the belief that money is not the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
Money is part of spirit, and it's a tool, but it's so often a burden. What's the most important thing, and this is me on the outside looking in, is they've created a business that appears to be committed to great food and treat people well. Not just have bring in a lot of dough.
Sure. No,
they
absolutely.
take care of that part and they're sensible about that part and they're good stewards, but yeah.
No, it's great. I mean, it's great.
Good food and treat people well. And treat money is a spiritual reality. And do you want it to be a burdensome spirit or an angelic spirit?
Nice.
And it will not become an angelic spirit if you hoard it or if you give yourself over to panicking about it, which is not the same thing as feeling concerned and asking someone to help you with your concern. That's fine. Everybody gets concerned about money. That's all right. But find someone who can help allay your concerns and be wise and so on and so forth. But don't make money the most important thing.
That's awesome. Big shout out to Zingerman's and the community of businesses who we've both kind of spent time with and admire hugely. And if you haven't been to Ann Arbor in Michigan and to check out and hang out over there, you should definitely go.
Yeah.
So this is right up your, the last question is right up your street, because I don't know if you're like me, but I wake up every morning and I get my cup of coffee and I go take a look at the news and I feel like I'm doom scrolling a lot of the time. And it's just like,
yeah, don't do that.
No, don't try not to do that. Sometimes can't help myself. I tell you what, I tend to start with the sport first, because it's like, at least it's the sport. And so I've been asking people in these podcasts in the recent months to help me end on a good news story or a positive note. So tell me, do you have a story that you've, or something tell me a story about what's the most interesting, positive, or exciting thing you've seen in the last week?
Yeah. I had a conversation yesterday with another person that Ari introduced me to.
Right.
Monken McGann, who's an Irish writer who writes about the Irish language. And he has a book about all the different Irish words for field,
Okay.
And, people might, and, if there'd be people who instinctively know that's what I'm really into. And there may be others who would instinctively go, that's got nothing to do with me, or what does that have to do with reality? To which I'd say the exploration of the beauty of meaning is far more useful to us than headline news. There are good journalists, and headline news is structured to scare us. That is what it is structured to do. Even if it is unintentional or unconscious on the part of the news companies, and I'm not naive about this. Like, there are people who are consciously structuring it to scare us because it will make us keep clicking and it will drive advertising revenue. But a lot of people are sort of either ethical or kind of neutral on this. They're just telling what they think is the news. And what we've evolved in our society is not the news. It's the worst thing that happened today, or something that kind of can generate gossip hits. The best thing I've experienced this past week has been a book about all the words for field might be more useful and meaningful to me than reading the headline news for a year.
Anyway, but I just want to say, like, in wrap up, just want to say, Gareth, well, first of all, big thanks to Ari for introducing us. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation about learning about your perspective around storytelling and kind of how we kind of can tell better stories, and just I've learned a lot and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, Adrian. It always helps me learn when I get to be in conversations like this.
Wow, what a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinsco.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. Do tune in again. Thanks very much.